Rabbis, good to be back with you again. Today's topic, as you know, is conversion. I chose this as one of the essential texts for two reasons. First, in my experience traveling to synagogues, being invited to speak as scholar in residence, it has been my experience that very often some of the most active, or even the most active of congregants, those who stand forward in leadership, have often been converts to Judaism, and that has made it evident to me, as I'm sure you find in your experience, that converts are an important part of our community. And we've got a history, we've got a legacy. The question of who are converts, how does our tradition relate to converts, and there is, I think it's fair to say, also a prejudice with respect to converts, not an official one, but one that has certainly been part of the community's attitudes. And so for that reason, because of their importance in our communities and because of the history, I thought it would be important to address this. It's also important, I think, because conversion has been one of the divisive issues in our community over the course of recent decades. As you all know, conversion is divided to orthodoxy from non-orthodoxy with respect to the question of what counts as conversion. Will Orthodox communities recognize the conversions of non-Orthodox communities? This, of course, has been an issue, resided, as it were, in Israel more than elsewhere, but what happens in Israel has great impact throughout the Jewish world. And so, in connection to that, I think proper attention will be paid to conversion and its status, its requirements in the tradition, just so that we have a little bit more to address these issues with. So I'd like to jump right into the text. These texts are very, very interesting, and I think that in some of their qualities, they're also very surprising. The surprise is that there are certain things we take for granted about what conversion is and what Jewish attitudes towards conversion have been. And I think that some of what we take for granted, to be sure, is not going to be supported from the sources that I've asked you to prepare here. So let's begin at the very beginning. Yevamot 46a, Memvav Amud Aleph. I'm going to pay particular attention to the rituals relating to conversion, because often rituals speak volumes about the attitudes behind them. It's often easier, that is, to find attitudes embedded in the rituals than to find them in explicit statements of doctrine or belief. There is a dispute here. I asked you to begin with a dispute. The dispute is in this Baraita, Tanu Rabbanan, Ger Shamal V'lo Taval, Rabbi Eliezer Omer Harei Ze Ger. So the question is, if we take the two major rituals by virtue of which a person converts, or using those rituals the person converts, circumcision for male and immersion in a mikveh for both male and female. This is particularly talking about a male. If a male convert has circumcised but has not gone into the mikveh, then according to Rabbi Eliezer, he is considered to be ger, he's considered to be a convert, shekein matzino ba'avotenu shemalu v'lo tavlu, because thus we have found with our avot, I don't want to translate that yet, obviously it means literally fathers or ancestors, but what it's referring to precisely I want to hold back on, that they, malu v'lo tavlu. I think it's fair to say that our most natural association when we see the term avot and think of conversion would be to go back to Avraham, to Abraham in the biblical story. Because as the first quote-unquote Jew, we often refer to him as the first convert. He is obviously the one with whom circumcision began. When we read the biblical stories, we see Abraham circumcising, but not immersing, at least not explicitly immersing. And so everything described here would very naturally apply to Abraham. Whether this is the proper reference, I'll come back to in a moment. Rabbi Yeshua takes the other side of it. He says, Taval v'lo mal, if someone immersed but did not circumcise, and this is for the moment talking about a male, Rabbi Joshua is of the opinion that Harei Ze Ger, this person will be considered to be a convert, shekein matzinu be'imahot shetavlu v'lo malu, because thus we have found with our foremothers, I don't know if that's the best translation, mothers for sure, ancestral females, if you like, that they went into a mikvah, tavlu, but obviously did not circumcise, yet they were considered to be converts. And then the Hachamim come along, the sages come along in this Baraita and say that both are required. Ein zager ad she'imol v'yitbol. Both of these rituals are required. The discussion continues. What interests me for beginning purposes is the question of reference. And the Gemara makes it clearer on Amud Bet what it has in mind by referencing here. The text says, near the top that Taval v'lo mal kulei alma lo pligei demahane. If a ger, a convert to be, has immersed but not circumcised, everyone, in this case everyone means Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, not the Hachamim. But those two parties agree, lo pligei demahane, this counts, it's effective. Ki pligei b'mal v'lo taval. Their argument applies only to the case where there's been circumcision without immersion. Rabbi Eliezer yalif me avot. Rabbi Eliezer learns from the avot who says, that case is mila without tefillah, fine. But Rabbi Yoshua ba'avot nami tefillah have. Rabbi Yoshua insists that the avot also underwent immersion. They also went into a mikvah. And the Gemara asks how we know this of Rabbi Yoshua, or if you prefer, how Rabbi Yoshua knows that the avot did not only circumcision, but also went into a mikvah. Manale, how does he know this? Ile mamid dichtiv, if you should say that it is because it is written, Lech el ha'am v'kidashtam hayom u'machar v'chivsu simlotam, quoting from Exodus chapter 19, speaking to Moses, God speaking to Moses, go to the people and sanctify them today and the next day, and have their garments be laundered, washed, kifsu simlotam. And now building on this, the Gemara says, Uma b'makom she'ein ta'on kivus ta'on tefillah, if in other cases where there's some degree of impurity, no washing of clothes is necessary, only immersion. The case given by Rashi is the Baal Keri, a male who's experienced a seminal emission. So that's the case where you require immersion without washing of clothes. Makom she'ata'on kivus, a place where they require the washing of clothes, this case here in Exodus chapter 19. Eno din she'ta'un tefillah, wouldn't it make sense that we should also require tefillah? This is rejected as not convincing because it may simply have been to have their clothes be clean. Nekiyut ba'alma. And so a second reference is given, Vayikach Moshe Tadam V'Yizrok al ha'am. Moses took, this is Exodus chapter 24, the blood, sprinkled it on the people, part of the great covenant ceremony at Sinai, Ugamire de'ein haza'ah below tefillah. And there is a tradition which says that there is no sprinkling of blood without also immersion in a mikvah. And then it goes on. We've got the essential point here. Notice the verses that are brought as proof for the present position. The question that I asked above was when the Gemara says Shekain matzinu ba'avot, or Shekain matzinu be'imahot, when thus we have found with the avot and imahot, despite the natural, quote-unquote, natural resonance of those terms, we hear avot, we think Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, we think imahot, we think Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, despite that resonance, that natural association, if you will, and the fact that when we think conversion, we think Avraham and Sarah, I mean, we even reflect that in the names, the tradition for naming converts. With all of that, it's the proof texts here that are telling. When they go to look for the models of conversion, they go not to Avraham, not to what we call the Avot, but without exception here and elsewhere, we see this also in the Krito text, they look without exception to Sinai. That is to say, Exodus chapter 19, the chapter which is the setup for the revelation at Mount Sinai, and chapter 24, which may come after that revelation. It may actually come before. This is one of the examples where the rabbis argue about the chronological order of the Torah, with the possible principle, ein mukdam u'muchar b'Torah. There's no earlier and later in Torah. And so there are arguments amongst the Mefarshim. Does chapter 24 begin? Does it belong with Exodus 19? Be that as it may, the reference is Mount Sinai. What this means is that for Chazal, for the Gemara, the model of conversion is not Avraham, it's Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, men and women, standing at Mount Sinai. And what we've got to ask ourselves is, why is that the model they insist upon? What's wrong with Avraham? Since Avraham is such a natural model, I have a feeling learning this text, I have to confess that I'm being played with. They give me avot, they give me imahot, I know about circumcision in Avraham, and yet they go to Sinai. Why lead me on, the student, to think of Avraham only then to reveal that the reference is Bnei Israel at Sinai? I don't want to argue that this is a response to, let alone a polemical argument with Christianity from the same period. I don't want to argue that, but it's actually an interesting possibility. If you think about it, Avraham is, for early and subsequent Christendom, the model of what it means to be a Christian, the one who is chosen by God out of God's pure love, grace, without any motivation, the one who in Paul's argument is considered righteous, just, by virtue of belief, before there are any mitzvot, before circumcision, in other words. Paul references Genesis chapter 15 and says, look, God considers him righteous on account of his belief, 2 chapters, as it were, before the obligation for circumcision. Abraham is a problematic model, because of the way early Christendom, Paul in particular, understood the model of Abraham. Whether the rabbis have that in mind or not, they don't want Abraham to be the model of convert. Why? Quite simply, because to convert to Judaism, in the opinion of Chazal, means not to believe alone, not to have a mitzvah like circumcision alone, but to stand at Sinai, to accept the yoke of commandments, although I will critique what I just said in just a moment. I think it's both right and not right. The crucial thing is that it is all of Bnei Israel. There is not a Jew who is not a descendant of a convert, not because we're descendants of Abraham, but because we are descendants of those who stood at Sinai. To become a convert means to enter into the covenant of law, the model of which was found at Sinai, and there is no compromising that image throughout the Gemara. So, if you skip to the next page and you actually look at the process, this is well known to many of us, the process and the ritual, it's interesting how it gets played out in the Gemara itself. This is near the bottom, 10 lines or something, from the bottom of Mem Zayin Amud Aleph, again, the Baraita, Tanu Rabbanan, Ger Shabalit Gayer Bizman Hazeh, a text that many of us have learned before. Omrin lo mara'ita Shabbat talit gayer. Well, why have you come to convert? Israel Bizman Hazeh. Don't you know that Jews have a lot of tzoros in our days? Right? And as you all know, but this is very important, Im Omer Yodea Ani, if he says, I know the difficulty of being a Jew in this age, Ve'eni Kedai, and I am not worthy, Mikablin Oto Miyad. He is accepted immediately, and he is told something, Modi'in Oto Miktsat, just a few of the minor commandments, a few of the major commandments, Modin Oto Onshan Shel Mitzvot, he's informed of the punishment of not performing the mitzvot properly once he becomes a Jew, but also, right, Shem Shemodin Oto Onshan Shel Mitzvot, Kach Modin Oto Matan Scharan, also of the great reward, because there is great benefit to being subject to Torah as well. This is straightforward and simple. It's fair to say that this would take no more than a few minutes. There is no system of education here, no insistence that months pass by, that conversion classes and all the rest. The assumption is that if he understands that this is a serious matter, he will be received immediately. The Gemara will say a word about this in a moment, but before I get to that, crucially, Ein Marbin Alav, don't do too much. Ein Medaktin Alav, don't insist, right, with all the details. Kibel Malino Tomiyad. If he receives this after learning just a little bit, we do the circumcision immediately, nitrapa, if he's then healed, matbilino to miyad, he's, goes to a mikvah immediately when he's ready. And then, very interesting, two talmidei chachamim, two sages, stand by him when he goes into the mikvah, and then repeat what happened before. Modino to miktzah mitzvot kalad miktzah mitzvot chamurot. Recite before him a few of the minor commandments, a few of the major commandments. Taval v'allah harehu ki Yisrael kol dvarav. If he comes out of the mikveh, then he's considered to be Jew for all purposes. Why, we have to ask, are they standing there and repeating what happened earlier? It's not for purposes of education, because he's already heard these things. So what's the point of repeating? I would argue that since the model of conversion is Sinai, the ritual means to recreate Sinai. And if you want to recreate Sinai, the only way to do that is to speak mitzvot, since that's what God did before the people through Moses at Sinai. And so Talmidei Hachamim, standing in the position of Moses, of course they see themselves as the receivers of the tradition of Moses, speak the mitzvot, and this ritually recreates the experience of Sinai. Sinai is about hearing the mitzvot, and it is going through that process that leads to being a ger. Interestingly, why is he received immediately? Why should he not be delayed? The Gemara says below on the same page, Shehuye mitzvah lo mashinan. We don't delay in doing a mitzvah. In other words, accepting a ger is a mitzvah. Accepting a convert is a mitzvah. Now, I want to comment on that, and then I want to say a word about this very obnoxious statement, which appears in the middle of this Gemara, which describes gerim, describes converts as sores, S-O-R-E, right? Sores to Israel. Kashim gerim li Yisrael kesapachat. In the Kritut text that I gave you, something very interesting happens. We again have mention of avot and a description of the three essential things, the three essential pieces to become a convert. They are not what we consider to be essential for a reason that I'll explain in a moment. Amar mar ma avotechem lo nichnesu lebrit ella. I have to go back above to the full quotation. Ella b'milah v'tfilah v'hartza'at dam. Just as our avot, that is to say, Israel standing at Sinai, did not become members of the covenant except through circumcision and mikveh and the acceptance of the blood of the sacrifice in the ceremony described in Exodus chapter 24. Afheim, so too future individuals who want to enter the brit, that is to say, converts, lo yikansu lebrit ela b'milad v'tfilah v'hartzat dam. In the eternal future, the three things that are essential are circumcision, for male obviously, going into a mikveh, and the sacrifice. Now you'll note, first of all, there's nothing about the acceptance of the yoke of the commandments. That doesn't need to be enumerated because of what we saw before. It's so essential, it's so comprehensive, that it's impossible to imagine conversion without it. It's not isolated because everything about conversion is that. Yet you do need a sacrifice. And of course, the question the Gemara then asks is, so what do we do in the future, right? How can it be that we accept converts once the temple is destroyed? There is no korban, there's no hartza'at dam. How can it happen? The Gemara says it this way. It's actually beautiful. How can we accept gerim? Now, they have to find a source. They need to, because they want to accept gerim. They want converts. As the Gemara said before, it's a mitzvah to accept. And so the Gemara actually quotes it incompletely. Rashi gives us the full pasuk. The pasuk is v'chi yagur itchem ger asher b'tochechem lidorotechem. The essential word is in all of your generations. So in other words, even if some piece of the essential ritual passes away, it is essential that gerim be accepted. I think we need to bear this in mind for two reasons. First of all, because what many of us have learned, and I think it's somewhat misguided historically, is the claim that Israel hesitated to take converts. Israel didn't want converts who weren't true converts. That's true. But that we did not accept converts and even possibly seek out converts, I don't think the evidence supports it either historically or in terms of attitude. As we can see here, accepting converts is considered to be a mitzvah, so much so that even when one of the essential elements of conversion passes away because the temple is destroyed, their conclusion is not to say we can no longer accept converts, which you might expect if we accept the claims making, the rabbis didn't want to accept converts, but actually quite the contrary. They bend the law to meet the demand of the reality. What about the negative attitudes? And we've inherited some of those negative attitudes. We've got this kashim gerim, kisapachat, converts are as difficult for Israel as sores. I asked you to prepare this wonderful long Tosfot on this very statement because it's so rich in what it says and gives us the range of attitudes. That's the range that I think we need to bear in mind. So Rashi says it's because converts, Tosfot begins with this quotation, Rashi says because they're not so good at mitzvot. Remember, they haven't been training in this for years, so they might not get it all right, and Rashi's concerned that it will be a problem that we've got Jews who are not performing the mitzvot. Or because Israel's responsible for one another, and if they don't do it so well, then we will be responsible. Tosfot rejects this. There are others who explain that it's because, and this is interesting, very much on the other side, the Torah warns in 24 places, according to the counting here, that we should never oppress the ger. And if ger means convert, this is an extreme expression, 24 warnings saying that we should never oppress the convert. This may or may not be a reason. It's just simply offered here. Tosfot then goes on and says, the reason that Israel is in the diaspora, the reason we were dispersed, according to the teaching of the Gemara, is so that we be available to win over converts. That's the very justification. And here it's a positive justification, though with some negative consequences. We should be spread so that others can become part of the Jewish covenant. One last one, I'm doing this out of order, is because, there is a racial purity teaching as well, and that may be one of the attitudes expressed here. It's certainly one of the attitudes expressed here. But the one that I want to draw attention to is the one offered, the penultimate explanation, by none other than Rabbi Avraham Ger. Avraham, the convert, who happens to be a rabbi, quoted here uniquely in Tosfot, and he says, right, speaking himself as a convert, Lefisha hagerim bekiin b'mitzvot. Not as was said above by Rashi, that gerim, converts, don't get the mitzvot all that well. Actually, they are very, very in command, bekiim, of the mitzvot. Umidaktakin bahem, and they're very careful to observe because they have become a member of this covenant, a member of this people, out of the full will of their heart. And therefore, they're difficult with Israel because native-born Jews are going to be compared to the converts. And frankly, in the comparison, the native-born Jews are not going to come out too well. And God will notice that it's the converts who are particularly committed, particularly caring, and not Jews who were born into it. I don't know which of these interpretations is best, but I do know that many of us will have experienced the truth of Rabbi Avraham Ger's interpretation. That is to say, Jews by choice, as we call them, are the ones who really care about this. If you will, in the well-known statement today, all Jews today are Jews by choice. Well, if that's true, then we learn from the Ger that we almost stand at Sinai, something we've all said, but crucial in this. If we're looking for a model, the model is the Ger. And the model that the Ger offers, the model that the convert offers, is the willingness to stand at Sinai and to enter this covenant with fullness of heart. It's a model that we could all emulate.